All right. Well, first of all, sorry about all the difficulties. That did suck. And second, if there's any designers in the room, this is not the font that we chose, just so you know. Anyways, back to the beginning. What Randall and I wanted to talk to you guys about today is RubyMotion. I'm sure everyone knows what that is, but just in case, show of hands, who has not heard of RubyMotion? Fantastic.
And where do you live, sir?
Just checking. That's good marketing. Okay, so first of all, Randall and I are the founders of a company based primarily in San Francisco called Thunderbolt Labs. We are a consulting contract development shop. We work, what would you say?
For whiskey.
We work for whiskey. And we just started about 9 months ago. We're about 5 people now, employees, and then about 6 contractors, something like that. So
12.
Yeah, 12 people. And one of the projects that we have is working on our RubyMotion application. We wanted to see what that was like as soon as the software came out. And we learned a lot from that. And so that's what we're going to share with you now. And I want to say in the beginning that it's important that you guys feel free to just basically yell out questions at any point. We prefer that to, just us standing up here and talking. It gets really boring. So, first of all, we're really good at a lot of stuff.
Modesty not being one of them.
I should have put modesty in there. I knew I was missing something.
Yeah, you missing modesty? No.
So there's a lot of things that we're really good at. I mean, clearly everybody in this room, we're all experts in our field. But I will say that iOS development was something that was new to us. So we're coming at this from a different point of view. We're coming at this from a Rubyist point of view and trying to learn the patterns and trying to learn the right way of doing both iOS and mobile development kind of all at once. So I think that's why we learned so much.
Just out of curiosity, has anybody here tried iOS, like actually learning Objective-C? Okay, now keep your hand up if you tried more than once. Twice? 3 times, come on. You think it's like pro? Nice.
So we're going to break this up into 3 sections, basically. First, we're going to talk about why you would want to look at RubyMotion, because especially with this many Objective-C developers in the audience, there's a good question of what's the point, right? And then we're going to look at the code and how it works, and then we're going to look at the painful parts of it.
I think that's what we refer to as the shit that's broken.
So first of all, let's look at some of the reasons why you would want to use RubyMotion. Now, the expressiveness of Ruby, it's hard to deny. Objective-C, there are some lovers, there are some haters. I'm a hater. I think that the whole angle bracket syntax is just abominable. And Ruby is really much better. And here's an example, again, of some Objective-C syntax that, people have to deal with on a daily basis. This is actually a very common method. I'm sure if you've programmed iOS, you've seen this before. And we'll go into this pattern in a bit later.
And just to be clear, Tammer also hates Lisp, so...
That's not true. I love Lisp. You just can't use it for anything. Another reason why you'd want to look at RubyMotion is because you don't have to deal with this anymore. Has anybody here seen Text from Xcode? It's a hilarious blog. But this is what I feel like every time I launch Xcode. I'm like, seriously? I remember Unix. Unix was great.
In fact, do you remember, did anybody download the Xcode from the App Store? Like when it changed the App Store? Did everybody have the problem where their shit broke until Apple's like, oh yeah, run this command line tool to uninstall Xcode because the Xcode uninstall doesn't actually uninstall Xcode?
How many people have had Xcode crash every time you restart it, even after you wipe your local preferences, the global preferences, and when you Google it, they say, oh yeah, you need to reinstall your OS. Look that up. So, you can use whatever you want. So it's much nicer for a Unix hacker to be able to use their editor of choice.
I didn't approve that slide.
I added that one in for you.
Thanks.
But we're much more comfortable in being able to use Vim, being able to do things like remote pair over tmux, which is something you just cannot do with Xcode, right? So you're back in comfortable tool land, which is nice. And then the other part that's really important, and this is not a technical difference, because I'm getting a little bit of feedback, if somebody could adjust that. This is not a technical difference, this is a cultural difference of how Objective-C community and the Ruby community differ. The Objective-C community is much more, they believe in much more straightforward, they don't believe in dry code, they believe in repeating themselves as long as it's very clear what's going on. And the Ruby community is much more adventurous and much more into what we term magical development, right? So they'll do anything they can to make the lines of code smaller and more understandable, even if you're not sure exactly what's going on under the hood. And that can be interesting. Not saying one's better than the other, but it can be interesting.
Yes, you are.
Yeah, I am. All right, so now let's take a look at some of the example code of what it's like to work on a RubyMotion project. So first of all, when you get started with RubyMotion, is there anything that you guys can do about the feedback? I'm a little worried about destroying the audience's ears. All right. So when you get started with a RubyMotion project, what you'll notice right off the bat is that all we're dealing with is the command line. And that's really beautiful. So just like with a Rails project, what you do is you run motion create and then the name of the project, and you get a directory structure you can deal with. It's a very familiar directory structure to Rubyist. And then you're just dealing with regular Ruby classes at this point. Yeah, that's much better. Okay, so just dealing with regular Ruby classes at this point, like the app delegate, which iOS developers will recognize. And then to run it and to debug it and to deploy it, you just use write commands. So it's a very comfortable environment to somebody who's used to Ruby and used to Unix.
How many people here have downloaded RubyMotion and just kind of played around with it? Just curious. Okay, so not that many.
Now, there are some fundamental differences. You're not actually dealing with Ruby. I think we all understand this. What's going on is you're using a variation of Mac Ruby that is using the new LLVM compiler in order to produce an executable that runs on an iOS device.
And embedding the iOS frameworks that come in the iOS SDK. I mean, what could go wrong, right?
We'll get into that in the last section.
Yeah.
But some of the fundamental differences is that basically you're bridging directly into Objective-C. And Objective-C is different in the way things are called mostly. The rest of Objective-C is actually very similar to the Ruby model. But some of the big differences, for example, is that in Objective-C, this method here has a name. Now in Ruby land, that name is just what you think of as the name of the method, but in Objective-C it includes the names of the named arguments, which are the arguments past the first one, which is just kind of weird and stupid. But anyways, so this one has a selector named matView region did change animated with some colons in the middle. Now what that means is it translates directly into this Objective-C method here. And it means that you can't view it as, even though it looks like the Ruby 1.9 hash syntax, it's not. You're not just getting a hash as the last parameter that you can play with like you would in Ruby. It's actually this last one, or it's actually a variable called animated that comes in. And it means that you can't use the same method definition to deal with the different, basically what Ruby does for kind of poor man's method overloading. You can't do that. You have to actually explicitly declare two different methods. It's got its pluses and minuses. Now, let's go into storyboarding.
So this is actually where we start our descent into hell. How many people have actually played with more than one version of Xcode, like any of the Xcode 2.3 releases? Okay, how many people actually used to keep a razor next to their keyboard for their wrists after Xcode storyboards and pretty much dragging buttons would just disappear in your nib files, right? Yeah, you're no longer with us. I mean, in fact, we're going to pour some sangria for them later, 40 for my homies. Normally, Tammer and I sit rather close to each other at our pairing stations, and normally I hear random cursing, and almost every single time I look over your shoulder, there's a storyboard or a nib file up. And just how many people know what nibs are? Okay, how many people think serializing your graphic interface into a small binary object and doing something called reconstituting or rehydrating it just sounds a little fucking weird?
Dude, it's totally clever.
Yes. Instant UI.
Yeah, so if anybody, so it sounds like maybe half you guys don't know what a nib file is. And what that is exactly what Randall said. You use Interface Builder to drag these interface elements onto the screen. And then when you save it, it has these running in memory and it serializes it and just drops it into your project. When your program runs later, it deserializes them straight into memory. Now they changed it to XML, but basically it's the same thing. Yeah. Deserializes it straight into memory and then hooks up some instance variables so that they can point at each other.
Because the binary that you didn't understand, which was opaque, is so much better now that it's XML that you can't understand that shouldn't be.
Yeah.
opaque.
Have you ever tried to edit one of those by hand?
Yes.
It's a terrible idea. So what they did after nibs is they said, well, this is such a great idea, let's expand upon it. And now what you can do is you can actually lay out your entire application. Now it's a little bit fuzzy, the resolution's not as great as it could be, but it's a little bit fuzzy. But each one of these is actually an iPhone screen. And so each one of these, in turn, is basically a single nib file, but they've got connections going between them.
And the reason this is actually a big deal is because I don't know if you've written any iOS code before, but if you haven't, people were so frustrated with Interface Builder that normally you would actually programmatically add every single button and every single element. So imagine instead not even like a node or application, but literally having to go through in Objective-C and say, give me a button, and I want this button to have the parent of this panel, and this needs to go here, it needs to be size this, the shade needs to be this. Oh, and I need to apply the bitmap for clicking, highlighted, over, all in code.
So a bit like JavaScript.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's other ones. I think Visual Basic had this kind of concept as well. I'm not sure exactly what the mechanics were, but it was the same idea. You just drag shit around and, oh, look, I'm a programmer. Which is basically what's going on here. You can actually have a full prototype of an application, which is kind of good for rapid development. So you can see what the application is going to feel like and then actually fill in the back-end code. Right.
This is kind of like the equivalent of typing Rails and then doing scaffold and then saying, shit, I got a Rails app.
Right. Dude, that's how I write all my apps. So this is one of the major advances of the latest Xcode. The other one is ARC, which gets rid of all that reference counting stuff. It's almost like garbage collection.
Except it doesn't work. I mean,
last section again. And ARC, by the way, is what enabled RubyMotion. The big blocker in the past was that Ruby couldn't run on an iOS device because you had to explicitly retain and free your memory, and it was, basically impossible without adding syntax. So what they did was once they had ARC in the LLVM compiler, they were able to get there. So between ARC and between storyboards, developing in Objective-C is actually a lot easier than it used to be. And it also translates to RubyMotion. Now, when you're using this, it's a little interesting. So you basically throw this storyboard into your RubyMotion application, somewhere in the resources directory, and then you can edit that storyboard with Xcode, and it brings up just like we saw. And then in your rake file, you specify what the storyboard name is. Then back in storyboards, you have to go to each one of those little fields, like the password box or the email box or whatever, and you have to give each one an explicit tag. It's just some arbitrary number. It's up to you. 666 is a good one. Next, in your view controllers, you actually have to ask the running view hierarchy for the view with that tag. All right. Now, the reason for this is because when you're dealing in Objective-C, you can just drag stuff, and it knows about your classes because Objective-C has this really terrible idea called a header file, is that if you want to step up at any point, you just feel free. All right. So because it has header files, it knows what your instance variables and your outlets and so on and so forth are, and it allows you to drag. But you don't have that in RubyMotion. So you have to be a little bit more manual about grabbing a hold of those fields in the storyboard.
and just as a side note, does anybody remember BASIC? Anybody write BASIC a long time ago? Okay, so remember that time in BASIC where you wrote a program, you started labeling the lines 1, 2,
No, 10, 20, dude, come on.
Right, because why did we do that? So highly recommend picking like a different zone for each one of your tag sets because you're going to be like, oh shit, I have 99 elements on this form. And you're going to run out. So go back to the basics, no pun intended, and like make sure you separate those things out by a couple. Don't put them sequentially because it's going to drive you nuts when you're actually having a click view on a nib that actually is behind something else, and you're like, why isn't this working?
Now, there's some libraries that people have done that basically you can imagine using a hash in order to map these things between names and tags, but it is painful no matter what. Randall, please check your microphone closer to your mouth.
Is this better?
No, that's creepy, dude.
That's actually creepy. I just got paged on a monitor up front.
Please stop saying what's on the screen. Okay, got it. All right, so another aspect of modern iOS development that we can use in RubyMotion is the concept of CocoaPods. So CocoaPods are basically the library management tool for all Objective-C projects. And it's fine. It's just like any other library management tool, except it has to compile stuff. Whatever, that's fine. And you can use it pretty easily in RubyMotion. There's a gem called Motion CocoaPods. You include that in your project, and then you just specify your pods in your rake file. It's pretty straightforward, but it's important to know about because it allows you to use things like RESTKit, which we're going to go into later. So now let's talk about some of the basic iOS patterns that we see in Ruby. So this is an example of how you do a map view in Ruby. Who here's dealt with a map view in a controller before? Raise your hand.
This is like how Google Maps works. Like,
yeah.
This is essentially like the little thing you always see and take me to the next stop or whatever, routing. This is actually how you load it up.
So first of all, every view controller has a method called viewDidLoad, and that happens, of course, as soon as your view's up on the screen. And you use that in order to trigger whatever you need to do to put the annotations onto the map. Now, we're not showing that yet because later we're going to show RESTKit and how you would get that stuff from a back end. But you do use map add annotation, and you give it whatever object that the map can understand. Here we're doing that same trick with storyboards to grab the actual map. We're memoizing it into an instance variable, and it's not actually for performance. Later we'll talk about how it's because ARC is a little fuzzy, and sometimes it gets confused, and you just get random crashes. And then here we've got a delegate method. The map view is going to call back to us, and it's going to say, what's the view for the annotation that the user just clicked on, basically. And we try and grab one that exists, and if it doesn't, then I'm sorry, actually, this is what's the view for the annotation that we're putting on the map. We try and grab one if it exists, and if it doesn't, then we create a new one for memory purposes. Now here's another controller. It's a common one in iOS, and this is a table view controller. Basically, it's called a table. It's kind of silly because it's really just a bunch of rows, no columns. But basically what we do here is this one is a special controller that understands that it has a table backing it. The last one with the map view controller is just a regular controller that contains a map, and we play with that map. This one has a bunch of methods that it's expected to conform to because it knows that it has a table in front of it. And here we just set the data source and the delegate to ourselves, which we'll talk about a bit in a second. We've got an array of coffee shops here. And when the table view asks for how many rows it's going to be displaying, we just tell it the size of that array. And when it asks to display one of those rows as a cell, then again, we check to see if there is a cell that's already in memory that we can reuse. If not, then we just generate a new one. So that last pattern, where we're trying to minimize the amount of resident memory that we're using, is the instance reuse pattern, which is incredibly common throughout the Cocoa framework. And so, again, what we're doing here is we're asking, if there's a reusable cell, basically as you're scrolling through the table on your iPhone, as some of them go off the screen far enough, then the table view controller says, well, these are not going to be viewed again for a while, and they're still in memory, so let's just keep them in a little cache. And when they ask for a cell of the same type, we're just going to hand back that. Now, we have to make sure that when we get that cell, we change the labels and stuff to match whatever the data is that we're trying to show. But that way we don't have to always be instantiating new ones. Now, if we can't find one, fine, we create a new one. Another one is delegation, which we saw in the last one as well. So we have two different delegations happening. One is for rendering those cells, which is happening down here, that same method that we just looked at. And the other one is for getting the data. So the table view controller understands that it can have a separate source for the data and a separate source for rendering the cells. The funny thing is, it's always self. Nobody ever, well, it's pretty rare to do a different delegate on especially the rendering one. But basically, the delegate pattern is it's a lot like callbacks. You're just saying, call out to this other object for a bunch of well-known methods. You could be passing blocks in instead, but you'd be passing in like 5 different blocks for like on completion or on error, things like that. So with the delegate pattern, you can just say, set the delegate once, and as long as I'm implementing those methods, everything's going to work just fine.
So it's actually worth noting that Objective-C takes a much more pure view of model view controller in a very small talk fashion. It was inspired more by small talk than, say, when you hear model view controller, Rails, we kind of took that and really kind of bastardized it. So it actually has a very strong model view controller architecture and why it depends on delegation. And Tammer mentioned something else. Understanding the callback lifecycle is really important when you're writing an iOS app, right? Because it's always, I'll call you, don't call me, right? That's the view on did load. And the problem, of course, is how do you get separation from doing that when you don't necessarily know what code needs to be called? And that's why the delegate pattern appears pretty much ubiquitously throughout Cocoa.
Yeah.
You're going to see it everywhere.
Yeah, it's incredibly common. Now that Objective-C has blocks, the Cocoa framework is starting to accept more blocks, which is useful if you've got delegates that only need to implement one method that's kind of a waste of a class. So you can just pass a block in instead. And Ruby blocks translate directly into that.
So how many people here actually did write Java for a while? Somebody mentioned Swing, right? Okay, how many people remember how painful it was to write Swing without anonymous inner classes because you had to instantiate a brand new class for every fucking button? Okay, I hear screams of pain and agony over here somewhere. Sorry for bringing up any bad memories. So with block syntax, hopefully it'll clean up a lot of Objective-C code because it literally is so common to see this crap that there is a template that you can literally just push a button and it injects everything that you need inside Xcode because they realize you got so sick of writing, okay, you're always going to do view on did load, and it does the exact same things in every single class, blah, blah, blah. So.
All right, so this last one's not really an iOS pattern, but it's such a useful library that we wanted to go into how this works. Whenever you're writing a client-server application that's going to be running on iOS with like a normal RESTful JSON backend, this is basically the go-to library for it. It's a very interesting library in how it works. I haven't seen a Ruby equivalent of this pattern, so I think it's worth going into. Basically, when you're using RESTKit, it happens in 4 steps. First, you have plain old Ruby objects, and this is what I like most about it. You don't have to include anything in these objects. They're just plain old Ruby classes, and RESTKit will map straight to them. So then you have to describe the JSON to RESTKit, and you have to describe what keys map to these Ruby objects, and then you request a random URL, and basically whatever weird JSON structure it sends back, any mixture of JSON of these objects encoded in JSON, it just figures it out and sends you an array of the Ruby classes that you asked for or that you originally configured it with. And we're not going to go into extreme detail, we don't have time, but this is a blog post we wrote about getting RESTKit to work with RubyMotion. So if you want more details, then just go to that link. So here's an example again. This is just a coffee shop class. It's just got some attr accessors on it, plain old Ruby class. Here's the JSON that would map to it. Now it's got this key coffee shops, and then it's got all of the attributes that we just listed out. So first, we tell RESTKit through this RK object mapping for class coffee shop thing, exactly how the JSON maps. Now, for this one, it's one-to-one with the keys, which is convenient. And there's actually a shortcut method that you could use with RESTKit to say, just map these keys and pretend they're one-to-one. Unfortunately, when you're using RubyMotion, that just crashes your app for some unknown reason. And then you tell the object manager, the key coffee shops underscore plural maps to that whole mapping thing that we just made. And then you just get an arbitrary URL, slash coffee shops, and we send self in as our delegate so that it calls into our methods down here, again with the delegate protocol, or pattern. So object loader did load objects, and here we just play with these coffee shops that we got, and they're just our regular classes, regular coffee shops. And then, of course, for failures as well, we can deal with that. So it's a nice pattern where basically it divorces the domain model from the JSON that's coming in and representing it. It's pretty cool. All right. So the final part of this, and the most interesting part, is it worth dealing with RubyMotion to write an iOS application? Like we just said, there's some major benefits that have happened with the latest release of Xcode and with Objective-C, ARC, blocks, storyboards, that make Objective-C actually palatable to work with. So, what are the issues with RubyMotion, and should we be using it on our next project?
And just out of curiosity, how many people here have an interest in writing iOS apps? None of you want to be like the next Angry Birds, really? Okay, I mean...
Dude, there's so much money in it.
Well, the other thing is actually, I mean, we run a consultancy, right? And honestly, what that means translates roughly into is we're whores for money. And people pay a lot to actually have iOS apps written. And strangely enough, most of them require a database backend. So they're actually coming a lot of times to Ruby shops to do those backends. And there's actually a pretty big market for writing iOS apps. So this should actually be a big question. Worth sometimes translates to dollars.
So yeah, the pain. Well, first of all, with RubyMotion, you can't use Ruby gems, which basically knocks out all of the interesting code you thought you'd be able to play with. Nokogiri, things like that. Say goodbye. And that's because RubyMotion can't do any runtime evaluation, which includes things like the method require, right? See, every gem that we know of uses require. As soon as it tries to call require, your whole thing just explodes, and it's no good. There are some specific gems that are written for RubyMotion that will work. They just don't use require. And there's talk of maybe in the future they'll find some way around that thing, which good luck. But between these, it means that you're very limited in what you can do, right? I showed earlier how we were memoizing something that's actually, this is a very straightforward call, and I'm betting it's a constant time call. So memoizing it has dubious utility in terms of performance, but more importantly, if you don't memoize all kinds of random stuff for seemingly no reason, your app just randomly crashes with a statement of, well, you tried to access something that you'd already freed. And I'm like, I don't even know how to free something in Ruby. What are you talking about? So you find yourself just sprinkling stuff like this in and kind of cargo culting, which is very frustrating when you're trying to debug these problems. And every time you debug it, you have to launch the entire simulator and click through a few times, and no, it crashed again. There's other strange bugs that happen. This was my favorite. I almost gave up. I want everybody just to pay attention to what this error message is saying, because I had to, and I want everybody to feel my same pain. This is wrong. Yes, I need more arguments, clearly. I don't know how I did it, but I passed in negative 13 million arguments. And it wouldn't tell me what method I passed that into. It wouldn't tell me the backtrace. It wouldn't tell me the line number. It wouldn't tell me anything. That was a lot of fun.
This was actually the point at which our company almost went under, because I helpfully suggested to Tammer that he should hook up GDB.
I think I threw my desk.
It's like, what? He's like, yeah, it can be painful, because when it core dumps. And honestly, the whole point of doing stuff like this is so you could get out of things like GDB, C++, and C, right?
Yeah.
So.
And you find yourself like having to launch Xcode in order to jump through this magic incantation of getting the symbols back so that you can actually see what methods are called, and then it doesn't still tell you anything. it turned out that there was some bug with that particular version of RubyMotion, and the good side is that I submitted a bug report, and a couple days later, or like a week later, they released a new version that fixed it. That's cool. That's nice and responsive. But it did take a week, and I couldn't do absolutely anything until that was done. So if you're working on a real project, or this could be a serious problem. Okay, here's another one. I don't know if you guys can read that, but this is what I was talking about with sometimes you just get weird ARC errors where it's saying you're trying to access something that's no longer in memory, and in Ruby there's no way of freeing stuff, so you're expecting ARC to do things correctly. Sometimes it doesn't.
So, do you guys actually, does everybody know what ARC is? Yes, no, nod. Is everybody awake, dead? Okay, how many people, anybody here ever write C++? Yes? Okay, remember smart pointer classes? Yeah, remember the first time you understood that assignment in a smart pointer actually transfers the pointer and the ownership of the pointer? This is what ARC is trying to get around, because you used to actually have to explicitly retain and release objects. But of course, Ruby, as dynamic language it had with only non-generational garbage collecting, says, I don't know what to do with that. And apparently RubyMotion tries to get around that, but it does a very poor job, actually.
Well, yeah, and what happens in Objective-C is that when you're declaring the instance variables, or actually the accessors for those instance variables, you give hints to the compiler that says, well, this is going to be, I think it's hard and soft retained, right?
Yeah, like basically, I strongly urge you to retain this object.
Right, and then ARC, which is built into LLVM, says, okay, I can kind of figure out when I should release and when I should retain.
Except for when you actually have to tell ARC, I strongly urge that you release this object. Because if two objects point at each other, then you actually get a circular reference, and it becomes really painful.
Yeah, it's like crossing the streams. You don't want to do that.
Yeah, no, don't cross the streams.
And then this actually just happened today. This was a lot of fun. So I was going to do a live demo, and I made the mistake of actually updating RubyMotion, because it said, hey, there's an update. You should update it. Oh, fantastic. I love updates. I'm going to update it. And then I tried to run my code, and everything breaks. And I didn't change my code. So I don't know. But it's kind of just the point is it's very opaque. And things can break fairly randomly. So it can be a pretty painful process.
Yeah, that one's probably related to the symbols actually that get downloaded with new SDK updates. If you actually are members of the Apple developer community, you know how they release point releases of the frameworks, and they have like hexadecimal numbers. They're actually small micro changes to the frameworks themselves, which can break links. Like literally your linker breaks.
Yeah.
We think.
We already showed how accessing views and storyboards can be pretty manual and brittle. There is a gem called IB, which basically looks at your code, generates a stub header file, and then opens Xcode, that opens your storyboard and points Xcode at that header file, so Xcode says, oh, okay, I guess I understand what your classes look like, and then you can do the dragging. So that can help out, but it is still a fairly brittle process. And then in general, there's just a lack of deep debugging tools, which is painful, like we just saw. And then, yeah, so I'm a huge test-driven fan. I mean, I've spoken a lot on test-driven development. I believe in it very strongly. Unfortunately, there's just not a lot of good tools right now for test driving RubyMotion in the way that I'm used to testing things. I'm very strong with integration tests and basically using Turnup and Capybara when I write a Rails application. And there's really nothing that works very well that I found for RubyMotion. So I found myself just going back to the old way of running it and clicking through and oh, well, that broke, and then doing it again. And it is painful. There's a lot of good unit testing tools because you can basically use it looks like RSpec. I think it's called Mac Bacon or something. You can use that to write unit tests, but when you're trying to write integration tests, it's just not really there yet. And here's the big thing, and this is, I gotta admit, when RubyMotion came out, I was like, yes, finally, like this is great. We can write Ruby on the iPhone, and now I can write iPhone apps as easy as I write everything else. And then I remembered, oh, right, Cocoa, it's still there. Yeah, Cocoa's huge. And it's really hard to learn the entire Cocoa framework and learn all the patterns inherent in it, key value encoding, delegation, things like that. So it's not just an easy ticket to writing a mobile application. Now, that being said, the Cocoa library is very consistent. So once you get the patterns in your head, things start to just kind of fall into place, which is nice. But it's an enormous library.
And then you find yourself opening Xcode just to get to the help.
Right. Yeah. So the other thing is, like we said, it's a closed source application. RubyMotion, you have to pay for it. I think it's about 150 euros, 180 euros, something like that. And you know, that's fine. I understand the business model, and that means that when I do file a support ticket, I'm fairly well guaranteed that something's going to happen in some amount of time. I just prefer open source stuff personally. But the people who wrote this need to run a business out of it, and I respect that. I've got no problem with that. But it does mean that since it's closed source, there's some parts you simply can't dig into if you want to figure out the problem on your own. And that's a problem. Yeah, go ahead. So what's the point of using it? Well, let me get some more pains in there first. Another one is that you're beholden to Apple, right? And although I don't think Apple would ever purposely kill RubyMotion, they could accidentally roll over it pretty easily. And that's a significant risk if you're on a long-term project. So the real question is, would we use it again, right? What is the point? Is it worth using this? I think that where we used it, which was on a small project that we were doing a collaboration with somebody else on, and it wasn't for a client production project, that was appropriate. And that's where I would actually use it again. It's absolutely not ready for production time, for production projects right now, in our view. We would not sell this to a client. We would consider it a disservice if we did. That being said, it's moving really fast. So a lot of those bugs that I showed, all except for the last one actually, are already resolved because I think his name's Laurent, is working on it so hard, and he's got a team behind him, that it is progressing rapidly. So my gut says that in about 6 months, it's going to be ready for prime time use. And I think a lot of the other pain points, such as how you integrate with storyboards, are probably going to be figured out by then as well.
So, okay. I guess questions?
Do we have somebody with a microphone? Great. I think he had a question. Alex.
Zed did too.
Oh, Zed did? All right.
See, that's actually a circular reference. Did you see that? We needed to release him and retain him.
So this is you're jumping into also a whole other area, but could you imagine writing something in RubyMotion that's kind of generic enough that you could actually reuse it for the Ruby framework for Android, and then just both of them would have some sort of wrapper or generic interface for interacting with the views, and then be able to reuse your code in for two different mobile ecosystems?
So you're asking me if I would actually do Appcelerator Itanium and write it again? No.
Yeah, I suppose so.
Well, but that's a good point, though. Theoretically, you could reuse, for example, the models in the front end and the back end. It's much like the Node.js argument of like, same code in the front and the back. And there is also the benefit of, if your team is an exclusively Ruby team, the learning curve of Objective-C just the learning curve alone of learning a new language and all the tools associated with that. But yeah, you could, theoretically.
We actually just deeply disagree with this. Because I basically say, if you want to write an Android app, write it the way they write it on Android, like C++ and Java. You want to write iOS, stick with Objective-C. But, Yes, Zed.
Just really quick, had either of you done a lot of C coding, extensive C coding?
I did when I was younger. I did mostly C++ neural networks.
So I actually started off as an embedded systems programmer, 8052C, then assembler, then C++. And then I spent that doing basically shit tons of C++.
Because a lot of those errors you saw, when I saw them, I went, oh, I know how to solve that.
Well, you would know how to solve that if you were coding in C.
Right.
With Ruby, it becomes more difficult.
So is the distance from the Ruby to the C so great you can't use Valgrind, you can't use
So
CDB.
it is literally like an opaque box. For instance, so think of it this way. It's RubyMotion, right? What it is doing is it's actually going through and actually making the LLVM modules and doing a matchup. So it's almost like having an old school overlay file and then calling those endpoints directly. And without going into too much into the Objective-C internals, you know that everything in Objective-C is basically a raw pointer, right? And then it actually has basically a dispatch table, like a V table, like a C++ object. And then it has a pointer and a function pointer. Those all have to be matched up. But the problem is it's really easy to do in Objective-C because you can load it into memory and call them by address like function pointers, like in C. That doesn't work in Ruby with Objective-C because it doesn't have even the concept of an address of a function. So what it does is it actually matches those things up somehow magically when it compiles your app using Ruby Cocoa, and it links the frameworks and it gets all the addresses of everything and it does the fix-up for you.
I mean, you do have an image that's dropped into your project directory that you could run Valgrind on and load it up and play with that. But knowing where in your Ruby code matches to that spot that you find the bug, that's the real problem.
And
right?
it does dump
So
symbols.
the issue is Valgrind would say it's here, and that's disconnected from some spot.
Yeah, it's like, okay, how do I access that spot, or what triggered that in
right.
Ruby?
And the stack of how it got there isn't the same as simple as a call stack with frame unwinding in like a C or C++ function.
So, for example, one of the issues, and I think they fixed this basically, is when you did adder accessors on top of, if you inherited from a Cocoa or an Objective-C class, did an adder accessor to override one of the existing accessor methods, it wasn't the same thing. So then it would get a crash because the adder accessor, even though all it should be doing is defining those methods, isn't actually just defining those methods or something. I don't even know why.
Yeah. So, anybody else? Questions?
Up
Yeah.
here?
As in the standard in RubyMotion, you have the logic in Ruby, but the library in Objective-C.
Sorry, go on.
Which means that you have to more or less write in two languages at the same time.
Do I need to repeat or?
Yeah, I'll repeat that. So your question was, in RubyMotion, the language is in Ruby, but you're saying, but maybe the libraries are in Objective-C, and so you have to write in two different languages at the same time. That's not really true. You do have to write Ruby that matches to the Objective-C calling semantics, like we showed earlier, but I never, at no point in time did I have to actually drop down into Objective-C, because it did compile, like if I wrote a plain old Ruby object, it did compile just like it. Go on.
You have to drop in Objective-C. How are you going to know what to call? You need to read Objective-C. There's no reference in Ruby.
You do need to be able to read, yes, that's true. You need to be able to read Objective-C,
Yeah.
and
So-
you're absolutely correct
So
there.
here's the thing, right? I actually kind of disagree with this. This is the whole point, right? After a while, you're starting looking at all the documentation in Xcode. You have to edit your storyboards in Xcode, then drop out of Xcode. And then when you actually want to go look up a method called autocomplete it, you look it up in Xcode.
Well, and then when you Google for how do I do this, all
You
the examples
register
are
in
in
Xcode.
or in Objective-C.
Right, in Objective-C. And then the other problems there actually are other mismatches. Objective-C was built on top of, there's the Cocoa framework and then something else called Core Foundation. And it uses something called toll-free bridging to call this old C++ libraries. But there are a lot of things, especially in the graphics libraries, that are actually C++ classes with something called toll-free bridging that wraps C++ classes in Objective-C. And if anybody's actually done this long enough, for about 2 years there was this abomination called Objective-C++. So if you want to see some fucked up shit, go look at template metaprogramming with square brackets all over it. It'll blow your mind, right? So it's basically what it really has to do with is more of your background, right? Actually, I don't really mind square brackets. It's C, it's not that bad. But a lot of people, for instance, that we've talked to today have never seen a raw pointer, and like the idea of allocating memory, it's like if it's not garbage collected, they aren't touching it, right? So yes, there's a talk about you're doing all this extra work, but then again, there's a talk about accessibility, right? Maybe for some people, this will be a far more gentle introduction to Cocoa than having to basically fire up Xcode and figure out how to do all this stuff, like header files and link errors. You know, this gentleman here writes an entire series of books that have the hard way on the end of it. So I'm pretty sure, you know, there are definitely other approaches to doing it.
Well, actually, RubyMotion is the hard way sometimes.
Yeah.
And do we have any other questions in the audience?
Yes.
Speaking of that, Cocoa is so huge. Is it possible to integrate core data with RubyMotion?
Yeah, it is absolutely possible. There's a couple of examples online. It's a little bit difficult. It's about the same as integrating the REST-kit stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, so is it possible to, I don't know, because defining schema in core data with Xcode is very simple, just clicking
Yeah.
in Xcode. And defining migration is also like clicking, so I don't know how to.
Some of that stuff is missing though from iOS, like key value encoding and some of the auto loading stuff.
No, now it's all there.
Okay.
I think, yeah, the core data stuff is now fully fleshed out.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
And so that is a major win, being able to use core data. Although I would argue that with Ruby, and it's maybe my preference, I'd rather just deal with the SQL tables directly, frankly. You know.
Okay, so I will look the examples on the side.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Anybody else? Other questions?
Well, hold on. You got the mic
got a
right
mic.
here.
Hi, so if you use it for production, how do you tell your client that it's possible that at some point you'll have to rewrite the app in Objective-C?
That's why we wouldn't use it in production.
You do it very carefully, hopefully while you're getting them drunk, and actually hopefully after they've paid you.
All right. Here you go. By the way, don't touch it.
And this would be a great time to up your rate.
Yeah, that's when you take the maintenance and operations contract.
One last question?
Was there another question?
Got one last one, and then we're out.
Where?
Nobody?
Raise your hand.
Not that I know of.
Say again?
The free developer license.
Is there a free developer license? No. It's
It's 100 euros, I think. Is it?
Is it coming? Okay, great.
Normally you will have access to everything except deploying to the iPhone.
Okay, so he said,
But in reality, you have to get the SDK from Apple anyway, which is $99 a year. And
So
the
you-
iOS dev program.
the answer, just to record it, was that a free developer license is coming where you simply won't be able to deploy your application, but you can run it in the simulator.
So yeah.
Do we have time for one more question, or is that it?
That's,
We're a bit
We're out of time.
off schedule, so yeah,
All right.
maybe at the
Wrap it
party we can like ask them more questions. I will do.
All
Because
right.
I'm really interested in RubyMotion.
Yeah, grab us afterwards if you have more questions. We've got a lot of stuff to complain about. So.
thank you.